All right, today let's contend with this idea of the conscience, and let's explore that further. Its etiology, or where it perhaps comes from, and its nature. This comes from Carl Jung in Civilization in Transition, specifically an essay on the psychological nature of the conscience. To get a few things out of the way early on, some misperceptions perhaps about the term. The conscience, one's own conscience, is not the same thing as the word conscious, which would be the opposite of the subconscious. The subconscious being that which is beneath the surface, which we're not consciously aware of, but still influences us. And our consciousness, or our conscious self, that being what we are aware of. Nor is the conscience to be confused with this idea of guilt or shame. Indeed, if one were to violate their own conscience, it could produce feelings of guilt, but these are not the same things. So many ideas since antiquity have been put forth as to where the conscience comes from and what its nature is. And this is something that we're going to explore further from a Jungian perspective today. An additional note, the conscience is not the same thing as Freud's superego. And we'll start with a quote from Jung on that topic. The Freudian superego is not, however, a natural or inherited part of the psyche's structure. It is rather the consciously acquired stock of traditional customs, the moral code, as incorporated, for instance, in the Ten Commandments. So we're already drawing a distinction here between the conscience, which Jung puts forth as something that is inherent to the individual's psyche, and Freud's idea of the superego is this constellation of learned norms and moral codes of the surrounding societal structure. That is to say, it is not inherent to the psyche itself. And Jung is saying that the conscience is indeed inherent to the psyche itself. Another quote from Jung, he says, "No one can guarantee that he has only noble motives. We know, some of us, far too much about ourselves to pretend that we are 100% good and not egoists to the morrow. Always behind what we imagine are our best deeds stands the devil, patting us paternally on the shoulder and whispering, 'Well done.'" This idea brings forth the question, does the conscience always point us in the right direction? You see, the conscience, which, if we think about some other symbols in more contemporary art, Jordan Peterson puts forth the idea of Jiminy Cricket and Pinocchio. And Jordan Peterson also says that if one were to sit down and ask their own conscience what it is that they could improve on or what they could do differently, that the conscience will put forth answers if one is willing to listen. But are we to trust that conscience at all times, or will it ever lead us astray? There is a further quote that I would like to offer before we continue to tackle that particular question. And it says, "Where does the true and authentic conscience, which rises above the moral code and refuses to submit to its dictates, get its justification from? What gives it the courage to assume that it is not a false conscience, a self-deception?" So this is touching on the same point. Often the conscience puts forth an idea, a notion that points us in a particular direction, often in a moral sense. And it puts this forth as something separate from the ego. It feels as though it's coming from a deeper part of ourselves, perhaps. And it puts forth the idea or the notion as something that cannot be objected to, that we know on a deeper level that that is in fact the truth, and then it is left up to our ego to contend with whether or not we will adhere to that, or if we will try to suppress it, try to circumnavigate it, so to speak. This idea that it has so much conviction has naturally led to the idea that perhaps this conscience is coming from God, or is indeed the voice of God. Another quote, "Indeed, its dictates were regarded as vox Dei, the voice of God." So this idea has been around, as I said before, since antiquity. We can think of figures like Socrates, who is said to have always listened to his inner daemon or demon or spirit, to have always adhered to what that Daimon suggested he do. And he, says that a lot of his success in life and a lot of his virtues are derived from his, decision to follow that inner voice. And to give another quote to add to this, in the darkness of a conflict of duty, he is to obey the voice of conscience without regard to the world, and very possibly act against the precepts of the moral code by obeying God rather than men. Another quote, both forms of conscience, the right and the false, stem from the same source, and both therefore have approximately the same power of conviction. This is also apparent in the symbolic designation of Christ as Lucifer, bringer of light. This idea that Christ and Lucifer are in fact brothers or mirror images of the same. And this is to speak further on the idea that this concern as to whether or not the conviction of the conscience is pointing one in the right direction has been around for indeed thousands of years. We can ask ourselves in more plain terms, if one is to truly follow their conscience, we can imagine in today's day a clear idea of two people who are convinced that they're following their inner conscience, but this is pointing them in two opposite directions. But if in fact the conscience is the voice of God and is directing us towards the light, so to speak, or towards truth, towards the right and moral thing to do, then how could it possibly point two different individuals in two different directions? Jung puts forth this idea that yes, some of this could sometimes be explained simply by self-deception or by ignorance on the part of the individual. But beyond that, this idea that there's a struggle between the two has been around for a long time. That's part of the big question as to the etiology of the conscience, whether or not it is the voice of God. So we'll add another quote. Is it not the task of psychological understanding to broaden or to narrow the concept of conscience? Conscience, in ordinary usage, means consciousness of a factor which, in the case of a good conscience, affirms that a decision or an act accords with morality, and if it does not, condemns it as immoral. This view, deriving as it does from the mores, from which is customary, can properly be called moral. Distinct from this is the ethical form of conscience, which appears when two decisions or ways of acting, both affirmed to be moral and therefore regarded as duties, collide with one another. So this idea that the conscience actually has two aspects, that which derives more from the moral, but there are times, particularly in individual cases, where two potential paths ahead of oneself are indeed moral. And then this puts forward the question as to which decision is more ethical. And so Jung says, as I find this quote so that I get it correct, he says, the decision is drawn from dark and deep waters. It is true that these conflicts of duty are solved very often and very conveniently by a decision in accordance with custom, that is, by suppressing one of the opposites, but this is not always so. If one is sufficiently conscientious, the conflict is endured to the end, and a creative solution emerges which is produced by the constellated archetype and possesses that compelling authority not unjustly characterized as the voice of God. The nature of the solution is in accord with the deepest foundations of the personality as well as with its wholeness. It embraces conscious and unconscious, and therefore transcends the ego. The concept of the phenomenon of conscience thus contains, when seen in a psychological light, two different factors. On the one hand, a recollection of an admonition by the mores; on the other, a conflict of duty and its solution through the creation of a third standpoint. The first is the moral and the second, the ethical aspect of conscience. This is to say that the conscience has a duality in its function, in its nature, and that its true etiology is from the whole self, not any one particular part of the self, not from this idea of the superego, and not from this idea of just simply trying to adhere to moral norms, but that it is putting together all of the relevant information and combining aspects of the collective unconscious and the individual unconscious together with the conscious motives and perceptions of circumstance to put forth a notion of what the truly correct course of action is. And I do personally believe that if one were to put forth an honest effort into hearing their conscience, into accepting its virtue, it begins with creating space. As we've talked about before, modern life is noisy. We're inundated with distractions, external opinions, and a constant stream of information. It's all vying for our attention. And in all of this, the subtle whisper, as it can sometimes seem, of our conscience can get lost. But making room for it starts with carving out those quiet moments of stillness, whether that be through meditation or going for a walk or just sitting in a quiet space, having some self-reflection. This is where you can begin to practice that ability to allow room for your conscience to emerge in a way where you can consciously perceive it and be aware of its suggestions. And then it's up to you, up to your own self, to decide if you're going to take those suggestions as you move forward in your own life. There's the trust of hearing your own conscience, and that's one thing, but trusting it to act on its suggestions, that's another. So, to wrap things up, Jung says that these sorts of questions are clearly not the types of questions that can be explored with scientific apparatus. And that makes them no less meaningful. It makes them no less important. In fact, these sorts of questions are oftentimes more important to the individual than many of the questions that scientific measurement can study and can explore. These are the sorts of questions that mankind has contended with for thousands of years, and many ideas have been put forth as to the nature of the conscience. But one thing is for sure, that we all tend to experience this phenomenon of the conscience. And in that way, it is a psychological truth or a psychological fact that it exists. The question is, do you trust your own conscience? And if you do, if you say you do, then do you actually act that out as well? Let me know if you have any further questions or ideas about the conscience, and let me know below if you enjoy this type of discussion. I found it really interesting to explore, and I look forward to exploring other topics in the next video. I'll see you.